Good evening. My name is Nora Tobin, and I'm here as the co-chair of the World Affairs series of the Committee on Lectures, and also a member of St. Thomas Aquinas Catholic Church and the Honduras Ministry Committee, and it's my pleasure to welcome our guest this evening. John Donaghy has been a member of the Ames community for many years. He served for 24 years as the Director of Campus Ministry and coordinator of the Charity, Justice, and Peace Ministry at St. Thomas Aquinas. In June 2007, he began his ministry in southwestern Honduras with the Diocese of Santa Rosa de Copan. He is now the Associate Director of the local diocesan social development area. I had the wonderful pleasure of visiting John a couple years ago, and it's been wonderful to be able to see the work that he's done. So he has a lot of information to share with us tonight about a view from the rural poor in Honduras, and also about the impacts of the economic crisis and the recent political coup. So please join me in welcoming John Donaghy.
It's always a delight to come back to Ames, although I've come back a couple times since I've been there, but it feels less and less like home and more like a homecoming when I come here. So I really have found my place. My home is Honduras. When I was asked to speak in April, I was thinking of a very different talk that I'm going to give tonight. I really wanted to share with you, and I'm going to share with you a little bit, what I see every day of the capabilities, the capacities, and the successes of the Honduran people, especially the Honduran poor. Because I think many times when we begin to think about these issues, we think about the poor. But I'm talking about the poor, who have power, who have dignity, and who do an awful lot. But the circumstances have moved me to speak differently. But one thing remains the same. My question is, what does all this mean for the poor and the marginalized? For those people in Honduras? Because what you see, I believe, is influenced, not determined, by where you stand. And for me, the preferential option for the poor and the marginalized means that I place a priority on the viewpoint that the poor have, and look at things and try to look at things from their perspective. I come from Honduras. See if I can get this technology right. I come from Honduras, which is a country in Central America, and it's about the size of Iowa, a little smaller than Iowa. However, it's mostly mountainous, so that if you flattened the mountains, it would probably be about 4 times larger than Iowa. But it has also 7.5 million people. This gives you an idea in terms of it. I am, as Nora said, a lay missionary with the Diocese of Santa Rosa de Copan in southwestern Honduras. It's the poorest diocese in a very poor country. The diocese is that area that is with red. The arrow points to Santa Rosa de Copan, where I live and work in other places. By the way, that little town underneath is Gracias, where another Ames person, Sister Brenda Whetstone, lives and works in the town of Gracias, and another Iowa Franciscan sister. So we've got 3 Iowans in the Diocese of Santa Rosa de Copan. The diocese, 70% of the 1.3 million people there live on subsistence agriculture. Most of them on hills of this like this. Basically, you're talking about 30, 45 grade hills. And just to let you know how hard it is to get around, 70% of the roads are unpaved. A few of them have gravel, which is nice, but most of them, it's either dust or most of the year mud. So that's the situation. But one of the things I want to start out with telling you, for me that's very important, is Honduras is a rich country. It's rich in its beauty. You can just look at the landscape. This is just one valley in Honduras, an absolutely gorgeous time. This is, of course, in the rainy season when it's all green. And the rainy season in my part of the country is pretty much from May to December into January. But it's beautiful. Mountains, forests, waterfalls, and a coast that I have not yet visited. It is absolutely a gorgeous country. It's a country that's rich in history, with incredible Mayan ruins at Copan Ruinas and a couple of other sites. It has some of the best sculpture that you can find in the Mayan ruins throughout the Central America region. Also with scores of colonial churches. This is one in a remote area that you can only get to by probably four-wheel vehicle most of the time. But that's an example. They're all over. It's got a richness there. It's rich in resources. Coffee, bananas, and much more. So when I bring people down there, one of the first meals we have is a meal of, if it's seasoned, mangoes, pineapple, papaya, and avocados. Fresh fruit. You can't get that stuff here. You can get it, but it's not the same. And bananas. So it's a rich country in terms of that, and it's rich, of course, with people like this little kid. It's also rich in gold mines and other mines, gold and silver and others. This is an open pit gold mine seen from one of the towns. I can talk more about that later because it's both a gift and a disaster, but that's another story. But it's a country that's also rich in possibilities. But it's rich in people who work. This is a training session in the parish I work in, Dulce Nombre de Maria, a training session for people to develop both family gardens and to work better for their, improve their working in basic grains of corn and beans. Notice, by the way, it's both men and women working. Here's a project of a tree nursery. And of course, everybody gets into the act, the willingness to do. So there's a richness of people who want to do this and who try to do it. It's a people who are rich in faith, rich in their faith. For example, here you have a Palm Sunday procession. You can just vaguely see that they sawdust carpets. This is in Santa Rosa. You have people who will give their time. This is a training for a catechist, religious education teacher, up in the mountains. Some of these people walked 2 hours to get to this meeting, stayed overnight, and walked back. They held it in this remote place because before they had just held it in the center and people walked 4 hours to get to it. A great commitment of the people, a people that are rich in willingness, rich in commitment. They're also kind of ingenious. They do skits. Yeah, I know. The priest has a Richard Nixon mask, I can tell you the story of this anyway, but it was a great thing in terms of, they were dealing with the whole question of the selling of moonshine. And the priest comes and as one person said is, she's the one who sells moonshine. If anybody having an apparition of Richard Nixon would probably decide to quit doing moonshine. But it's that type of creativity that you find, and hospitality. The great sense of hospitality. I don't know how many times I've visited poor places. And what do? Offer you coffee and cake or a meal. The hospitality is one of those things that you have. And of course the hospitality comes in just sitting around on the front of a church, just sitting and talking together. But it also has people with great capabilities. And I'm going to talk about two of them right now. Petronila. I just met Petronila once. Petronila is a woman who, in the 60s and 70s, began to be working in programs that Caritas, which is the social development agency of the Catholic Church, but the one in this diocese, she was working with them. But she said, before I was involved with Caritas, I was a nobody. Now, I'm able to do things. We're working on a micro enterprise. We're working on other things. And one of the women in our group is running for mayor. And somebody asked her, well, are you the campaign manager? And she smiled and shook her head. In this village, she's a woman who has incredible gifts and is using them. But here is one of my favorite people, Moises. And I know two people here who know this guy and have seen him. Moises has, yes, that is corn. And Moises is not short, he's tall. That's one of his corn. He has about a little more than an acre farm on the side of a hill like this, more rock than soil. He's been there, I think, 8 years. He has, I don't know how many, maybe 4 or 5 different types of citrus, mostly orange and lemon and limes. He has about 20 different crops. He has chickens, pigs, and rabbits, I got to translate, as well as 2 fish ponds with tilapia, all on this land. He uses mostly organic practices, making his own organic fertilizer and teaching others to do it. He has a center there where he trains people with these practices. Moises has had at most 2 years of formal education. 2 years of formal education. His knowledge, I think, would be the envy of many an agronomist here at Iowa State. And his farm would be the envy of many agricultural researchers. Because he's trying different things. He's trying to do different things. Of course, he uses velvet bean, frijol de abono, and other things that fix the nitrogen in the soil. This is the type of knowledge that I keep on finding. My friend introduced me to Moises, but I found since that time many other people like him who have this incredible knowledge of agriculture and of practices and of doing things that are absolutely phenomenal to help enrich their country. Of course, there are people of great faith, probably 90+% Catholic, not all of them practicing, of course. But here they are. This actually is in a church that the people built. This is in Plan Grande, where we have 2 of the people who helped put the foundation down in that. We have kids, you have kids who are part of that. But the other thing is their faith, which is a really deep piety, is connected with what I call a real deep concern for justice in this diocese, especially in Santa Rosa de Copan. The Friday before Holy Week, they have what they call Way of the Cross, following Jesus' way on the way to Calvary. But what they do is they do it with the theme of justice. So you see all these people, most of the people coming in from outside, and they have it, priest hearing confessions on the street, but they have, stopping at this, the typical image of Christ carrying the cross, but right next to it, a anti-mining sign that says, life is more valuable than gold. And it's cyanide, because the process of gold mining in the area uses cyanide. So you have this type of thing that you find in the thing. This is the richness. This is the deep richness that you find in the people. You find a willingness to learn, a willingness and a wanting to analyze. Here was at a meeting we had, and they analyzed what this group saw as 4 major problems in Honduras: extreme poverty, destruction of nature, disintegration of the family life, and corruption. This is what they saw and what they see. And we have, I think, one of the richest, where the area where I work is the bishop, Bishop Luis Alfonso Santos, a bishop who's committed to standing with the poor, who has stood up against mining interest and corruption and has received death threats. He has at times a policeman who acts as his bodyguard. And he has, since the beginning of August, spoken out forcibly against the coup and the wealthy elite he says are behind it, and whom he sees as gangsters and robbers. There's a richness. There's a great richness there in Honduras. But it's a country that is impoverished. Honduras is the 3rd poorest country in Latin America. According to World Bank statistics, 50.7% are below the poverty consumption level and 23.7% below the extreme poverty level. However, others say that the poverty level is more like 60 or 70%. And I'd say that where I live, where I work, in the Diocese of Santa Rosa de Copan, it's probably at least 70%. Well, what does this mean in reality? In the parish where I'm working in a rural parish, Dulce Nombre de Maria. They have a program that they got money from a Spanish foundation, Manos Unidas. And what they're doing, and they began to do, is to work in 23 communities, pick the poorest families, and then find out what is the situation. So they did what they call a baseline data analysis. And they went and they've looked and saw that most of the people, their diet is corn tortillas and beans. That's it. Occasionally, eggs or milk, probably in the form of cheese. Very few vegetables. Meat, almost never. So you have a question of a diet that is very poor. Now, part of the project that is there is not only to help them in their basic grain production, but also to do family gardens, to help diversify their agriculture. So, but look at the situation. Housing. The analysis found that most of the homes, and of course these are the poorest, have dirt floors. Some have cement, but most have dirt floors. Some of them have land, maybe a half an acre. A few have coffee lands, but a substantial minority have to rent land, even for the basics of corn and beans, sustenance. When harvest comes in, what happens? If they have more than they need and have no place to store it, they sell it. And then, as a friend told me, when they run out, 5, 6, 8 months later, they have to buy it. And he gave me the numbers, and it was close to twice what they had sold it for. You have this impoverishment. Now, the one thing in our area especially where people can do things is a coffee harvest. Whole families go out from November to February, which just happens to be the school holiday, and they go out, whole families go out and pick coffee. Usually for a gallon container, it's probably about 20 lempiras, which is about $1.10. There is one coffee plantation owner in the place where I go in the parish who gives them 30 lempira, which is about $1.60, which is really a much more just wage in terms of what it is. But you see that in many ways, that's part of the situation for the rural poor. But what's happening to impoverish these people? There's a lot of different things. Education. Education is the real interesting thing. Compulsory education to the 6th grade is what they say. But I don't know how many times I've gone and talked to a group of young people and asked them, are you in school? No. Are you, how many years did you have? 6, 3, 2? I don't know the exact statistics for how many finish 6th grade, but you should know only 33% go beyond the 6th grade. So you have a society which has major problems in terms of its education. Corruption is a major problem there. According to Transparency International, it's the most corrupt country in Central America and the 4th most corrupt in the Americas. What does that mean? One of the projects of Caritas is to train people how to look at the budgets and the expenditures of money in their municipalities and from the mayors and the mayor's office. And so what did they run across a couple weeks ago? Oh, all these monies are being given to these people, and it says because they belong to one of the parties. They're getting the grants because they belong to a certain party. Or I know where in the last primaries, which were last November, people were approached by one of the persons who ran but was not elected as the party's candidate for the presidency. They were approached with promise for money for an electrical project in their village. Those are just some of the things that happen. But part of that, too, is that you have a situation where though there are like 5 parties, there are really 2 parties. And between those 2 parties, the National Liberal Party, and I don't really believe there is much difference between them. They're both part of the traditional, what we call European model of the Liberal Party, which is basically freedom, the emphasis on freedom, mostly free enterprise. Then you find them being the ones who pretty much control the situation with what I see as a rampant patronage system. For example, somebody I know is a school inspector. I ask him, oh, how long will you be a school inspector? He said, well, it depends upon the next elections. If the other party gets in, they'll have somebody else in as the school inspector. Some of this has been improving a little bit in the last couple of years, but it's still there. It's still a major problem, this patronage system. Somebody I know was offered a position to help advocate for an airport in the area that would help the tourist industry. He was not a member of the right party, and so he was not granted the job. This is really a question of a situation where it takes the whole thing. It's not what you know, but who you know. It takes it to infinity and makes it really difficult for things to get done. So it's not always the people who are most competent who get the jobs, but the people who are most connected. That's really one of the other problems. There's a concentration of political and economic power in the country, as well as the means of communication. Newspapers, television, radio stations are largely controlled by a number of groups of people, same group of people. People talk about 10 families. I'm not sure that that's right, maybe 10 extended families. But there's a small number of people who have the concentration of wealth, power, economic power, political power, and power in the means of communication. The one statistic I've seen that the richest 10% of the country have 35 times the wealth of the poorest 10%. That's a CIA statistic, by the way. In the U.S., it's 15 times, just to give you a comparison. But the other thing that I think is one of the things that is really problematic is what I would call racism and classism. There are several indigenous peoples, but the one group, the Lenca, was pretty much lost, or their language in the 19th century. They're small groups. They've lost a lot of their language and culture. But also in the North Coast, there are the Garifuna and others who are descendants of slaves and other Africans or African Americans from the Caribbean, African Caribbeans who came in. There's racism there. But there's also what I call classism. A prominent congressperson, who is now a high member of the coup, called the people from the countryside who were advocating something opposed to what he said. I think it was advocating for mining change. He called them gente de la monte, which means hillbillies. He publicly called them hillbillies. That racism, that classism, I think, are some of the major problems. And it's in this framework that the coup happened. And I believe the coup is a result of a long history of impoverishment and concentration of wealth and drastic economic disparity. And I think I agree with the Bishop of Santa Rosa de Copan, who's pretty much my boss, but I disagree with him on some things. But I agree with him when he says that the wealthy elite are behind the ouster of Zelaya, who was the president. July 28th, I woke up, got up, went and took a shower, but it's one of those showers that have the electric thing in them, and you get hot water right away. And all of a sudden, the lights went off, and I had to finish with a cold shower. I figured, what's happening? It was the day it was supposed to be an election for a poll on whether there should be a ballot question in November on whether they should have a constitutional convention. And it had been very, very contested. Electricity was off, but I have a laptop, and I have one of those little things that helps you access the internet without having to plug it into anything. So I was able to get on and found out that the president had been arrested by the military, not the police, and had been removed from the country. A few hours later, the president of Congress, Roberto Micheletti, was declared president by the Congress. Things kept on happening. A resistance movement began. Groups, all sorts of different groups, and some of them were teachers, some of them were union people, some of them were the indigenous people, some were the Garifuna from the coast, and some of them were just poor throughout the country, have demonstrated, mostly peacefully, but not always, every day since then. And I believe today is the 114th day since the coup. There have been repression. We've had coups. One of the more interesting ones, we had 40 hours coup, a curfew where, 4 o'clock Monday, we were not supposed to go out until 10 o'clock on Wednesday. Very interesting thing. So we're all stuck inside. People in my neighborhood, we did a few things the first night, including playing with dogs and silly dog tricks. But what it is a situation. A situation in terms of what I think is to isolate people and to create fear. In our area, where I live in the western part of the country, it's very tranquil. It was very, contested in the capital, in Tegucigalpa. It was very, very tense there, and there were a lot of things that were happening there. But in our area and throughout the country, we had to stay in the houses for 40 hours. There have been some deaths also. A couple of other things happened. Some of it you can check in the newspapers and what somebody may write a history of it. The Costa Rican president, Oscar Arias, was asked to lead talks, which came to an accord but broke down. September 28th, the president who was thrown out returned and finds himself in the Brazilian embassy. There have been curfews, the state of emergency, closing of a radio and TV station, and other things. The Organization of American States helped to initiate talks, which broke down last week, and they were supposedly meeting today, and I haven't found any message. I haven't been able to find out what happened. Probably nothing. But I think it's really important to recognize this is not merely a question of one person, Zelaya and Micheletti. It's a larger question. A Dominican provincial member of the Order of Preachers put it well, writing back to his the Dominicans in Honduras from where he lives in El Salvador after a visit. He said, "Although we, together with you, call for the return of President Zelaya as constitutional president of Honduras, we do not believe that the principal conflict is only between Zelaya and Micheletti. We believe that there is a real confrontation between those who hold on to their own economic interests and those who defend new alternative models which try to incorporate the interests of the majority." It's, as I say, it's a question of some rich and many poor. That, to me, is what I see as the situation. What led up to it? I'm trying to figure out how much I should cut out. I think I'm going to cut out a fair amount. A lot of things came out, but the president who was sent out of the country, Manuel Zelaya, is a member of the Liberal Party. The current president, the de facto president, is a member of the same party. Zelaya comes from a fairly rich family of ranchers and timber merchants. He was elected in 2005 and began serving in 2006. But my question is, what angered the elites? And I think this is an important question. What angered? One thing is, when he came, he wanted to start they wanted to bring in what's called a law of transparency that would give people the right to set up a transparency commission and commissioner in each of the municipalities to examine these things. It took him quite some time to put it through, and even his own party was against him. When situations got pretty bad in the midst of skyrocketing oil prices, when the oil companies wouldn't respond to it, he took over oil storage facilities to check profiteering. Later, he took an offer from Venezuela to get gas at 60% of the cost, and the other 40% to be paid off in 40 years at 1% interest, to provide access to oil and gas for the country. He did join the alternative to CAFTA, which has Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. Just the beginning of this year, he raised the minimum wage from $6 a day to $9.50 a day. Still one of the lowest in Central America. Probably a precipitous thing that he did, but still, it's the lowest in the region. There were many disputes in the beginning of this year over the Supreme Court justices and the Attorney General and the Electoral Tribunal, who are appointed by Congress. The president can suggest names, but it's not a nomination process like it is here. And it was highly politicized, so that the Supreme Court has 15 members, 8 from one party, the Liberal Party, and 7 from the other party. Politicized, keeping the control in the hands of 2 parties largely. There are a number of things he also did. He angered Catholics and evangelicals when he vetoed a congressional prohibition against the day-after pill. As I said, in May he introduced a law in Congress that would change the mining law. And then his big thing of having a ballot question. First a referendum, which was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and then a non-binding poll that he said. There were all sorts of other things he did at this point, including firing the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, including going and taking the ballots from where they're being held in, and other things like that. But what happened is, on June 28th, he ended up being removed. There was a concern of some that this would bring about that what he was trying to do was bring about a new Venezuela and be just another Hugo Chavez, and that Chavez was pulling the strings. Chavez was there, but I think it's overstated. And of course, Chavez didn't help anything by his rhetoric, which is really, really pretty awful. He doesn't know, I would say, how to keep his mouth shut. There were rumors of coups as early as last September and as late as 2 weeks before the actual coup. But what I found reading the press and hearing the radio in the months before the coup were, first of all, incredible politicized language. Not just politicized language, but language which was really awful. It was demonizing the other. Mostly it was demonizing Zelaya and Chavez and others like that, although some of Zelaya's supporters also did demonizing. It was an awful situation. But also there were all sorts of rumors and a fear campaign and scare tactics abounded. It was said that they were going to have, everybody who had an extra home was going to have to give it up, and if you had an extra room in your house, you'd be forced to take in families. There was another rumor that 12-year-olds would be free from parental authority. But here's, I know, there's no 12-year-olds here, are there? But then the clincher, this is the clincher that was told to me by somebody 3 weeks ago, that his evangelical pastor told him that Zelaya was going to permit gay marriage. Never heard that. These were the type of scare tactics that were being used. There were also reports of corruption in the Zelaya administration, something which I do not doubt. In fact, I know someone who quit a high position in the Zelaya government because of the corruption. But I saw him the weekend after the coup, and he agreed with the bishop and the priest of the Diocese of Santa Rosa that it was a coup, and then it was brought on by the injustice. And he did not think that there should be a coup. Despite his opposition to the corruption, that he basically risked his career by his resignation. He did not see the coup as being the answer. But I think it should be noted that Zelaya had promised a lot to the poor and had initiated some programs that helped children attend schools with grants, or provided grants for poor farmers and subsidies for electrical payments. But this is what I think Zelaya represented. And this was told to me by a neighbor who was not really, I would consider, poor. Her husband is a unemployed doctor. Yes, unemployed doctor. And she said to me about this time, before Zelaya, the people who would go into the presidential palace would be people with money. They'd be the one who going there. But with Zelaya, the poor would come in there. The people who are chuño, barefooted. The people with the people with botes de hule, with rubber boots. You know what rubber boots are if anybody of you come from a farm. With those boots would be welcomed in. He represented, and wasn't completely, I believe, but he represented a sign of hope for the poor. And I heard this from people, not just for the poor, but some other folks, including a good friend of mine. He was erratic at times and a bit of a showman, to put it mildly. Just watch him with his big hat. Though he has done wrongs, a coup is not the solution. There's a great statement from one of his aides who said, "The errors of democracy are corrected with more democracy. They are not corrected with coups." And I think that's... Most of the press is against Zelaya, as well as most of the rich, who own most of the means of communication. He has received early on the support of the Catholic Bishops' Conference, as well as some major evangelical leaders. But there are evangelicals and Catholics, especially the diocese where I work, who are opposed to the coup. The Bishop of Santa Rosa, in fact, has condemned the coup, as well as most of the priests of his diocese have done it, even to the point of celebrating masses at the end of anti-coup marches in the diocese. And in the last month, one of the richest persons in Honduras, and the owner of El Tiempo, Jaime Rosenthal, came out against the coup. So you have some very interesting things happening. And a poll was taken about 3 weeks ago that found 53.7% of the people against the coup, with only 17% for it. The rest would not respond. Where will this go? I don't know, and I don't have a crystal ball. It's extremely complicated. And if you're confused, welcome to the club. But the real crisis won't be solved even if Zelaya is returned to office and even if the November 29th elections are internationally recognized. It won't be solved. For in the wake of the coup, one of the things has happened. There's been a movement has arisen, not extremely well organized, but representing probably 100,000 people, teachers, union members, women's groups, indigenous groups, Afro-Honduran groups, and the poor. They are calling for the return of Zelaya, but they're also calling for the return of the constitutional order, and many of them are asking for a constitutional convention to rewrite the Constitution. Now, Honduras, I believe, and these people believe, needs a new constitution. There's been a breakdown of the order. A new constitution that does not privilege the already privileged. It needs a constitution and order that encourages and permits the participation of those poor, people like Petronila, people like Moises, people like the other people that I know in the countryside, that allows them to have a role in determining the future of their country. And it needs an economy that is much more equitable. It needs to be a true democracy. In an interview in August, Bishop Santos of Santa Rosa said, "There has never been a real democracy in Honduras. All we have is an electoral system where the people get to choose candidates imposed from above." He's pretty strong. The people don't really have representation, he went on, whether in the Congress or the Supreme Court, which are all chosen by the rich. We're the most corrupt country in Central America, and we can't talk about real democracy because the people don't participate in the decisions. That's his position, a very strong one. A very strong one. But what's going to happen is a long process that has to do. And I hope and pray, and I see some signs that it will be peaceful. But it cannot be solved in a day. And it must include a place for the people in those villages. Not just the people in the cities. Not just the people in Tegucigalpa, the capital, or in San Pedro Sula, the industrial capital. It needs to include all. The critical question for me is how the poor majority who have been marginalized are being affected and how they will be affected. Decades ago, a score plus years ago, the U.S. bishops wrote a pastoral letter on the U.S. economy and summarized their concerns in 3 questions. 3 questions that I think are extremely valid for this situation and for probably all situations. And the questions are, what does the economy do for the people, for the poor, in a positive sense? What does politics, economy, what does it do for the poor? What does it do to the poor in a negative sense? But they didn't stop. And the 3rd question for me is the crucial question. And how do the people participate in the economy? How do the people participate in their country, in the development of their country? They've got capabilities, massive capabilities. I could tell you more stories of people I know who have done amazing things, especially in terms of agriculture. How do we help them to participate in the future of their country? For that, to me, is, I think, the critical question. And I hope and I pray, and I'm going back next week, and I'll be back there, hopefully working alongside the people I know and the people I love and the people who are amused by this crazy gringo, and that they will be able, I hope and pray that they will be able to participate in their country's economy and politics in a way that really promotes the common good and the good of those who are most in need. That's my hope. That's what I think needs to be done. And that's what I hope that we, both here in the United States and Honduras, can work on. That all of us can be a part of. That all of us can find a way of dealing with. I want to close with just quoting for you the objective of the diocese I work in. It's got religious language because it's a church group. To work for a diocese, organize and base church communities, that's small groups of people who meet every week in their communities, and in our diocese is probably between 2,000 and 3,000 groups of between 8 to 15 people to pray together, to look at their situation, to educate about. In base communities that are in solidarity, prophetic, missionary, and transforming, contributing to the formation and the integral liberation of the human being, with a preferential option for those most in need, in order to make present the kingdom of God, a kingdom of justice, a kingdom of love, and a kingdom of peace. That's my hope, and in many ways, that's what is guiding where I work and the people I work with, and I hope it's guiding me. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We have some time for questions. If anyone would like to ask any questions, just come on over to the microphone in the center.
Questions, comments. There's got to be a couple things. It's my perspective again, and I don't have the answers. Yes, Ellen.
Hi, John. Thank you for your talk. It was great. I just have. I would like to question your perspective on the School of America's involvement with the coup. There's a lot of talk that they had a hand in overthrowing Celias.
I have arguments with people, some people I work with, about the role of the U.S. in the coup. That's a big question. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was involved in the overthrow, was educated in the 80s at the School of the Americas, which is a place right now in Fort Benning, Georgia, that now with a different name, and I cannot remember its new name, Western Hemisphere, something like that, WISC. And it has trained people. It was involved with training people who were involved in human rights violations in the 1980s, especially. So it's the whole question of what really happened, and I'm not really sure. There are people who believe that the U.S., maybe not the U.S. financed the coup, but there were people that were being financed that ended up helping the groups that were supportive of the coup. I do not know. I cannot make a judgment on that. Other people I know think the U.S. was behind the coup. I am a little skeptical. But I would say that what the U.S. has been doing recently, and especially some of the recent things I've heard, is not helping deal with the situation, because it's giving, what I would say, hope to the people who did the coup, and I think that's been helping them to do delay tactics for any type of a solution. That's my opinion, in terms of what the U.S. policy is at this point. But it's in terms of the U.S. involvement, and especially even the U.S. involvement through the School of the Americas. I am, put it this way, I am, agnostic in terms of that. I don't know, and I don't want to state something that I don't know. Thanks. Other comments, questions?
This is a slightly broad question. Could you comment on liberation theology? Is it alive and well still in Latin America or not?
Okay. Where I live, in our diocese, really it's in a sense living out liberation theology to a degree. I mean, there are certain parts of it that in liberation theology that have not been lived out. But the whole notion of the preferential option for the poor, the working of base communities, which in our area are not that politicized, although in some other areas they are, the notion of that the question is the integral liberation of the people from all kinds of slavery. That is something that is part of the life. In fact, one of the things that the priest want for next year is some work with the people on spirituality of liberation. So, other places it's not. There are other parts of the church in Honduras where it's very much not that case and somewhat opposed to it. So, but where we are, it's very clearly that the preferential options for the poor is central. Yes.
You talked about a lot of the problems that the coup has produced, and you've also talked about how the poor, or at least most of the areas inside Honduras, are focusing on demonstrating. So my question to you is, what's your next step for the poor? Because during this coup, most people would probably not be focusing on the poor. They'll be focusing more on their own personal problems. So what's your next personal step for the poor?
Okay, my next step when I go back, very specific. I'm working with Caritas, which is a social development agency. I will be going out with some people to the poorest area of the country, to the area that has the poorest municipality, the poorest county, working with the people there in terms of trying to identify their capabilities as well as their needs and their visions, and to help develop a project that will send to a funding source for a 5 or 8 year project of development for that community so that they can have a sustainable development in their community. That's exactly what I'm doing and planning to do very specifically, and that's what we're doing in one place, and we'll probably try to do it with 3 other municipalities, which are sort of like small counties. So that's the type of stuff that has to be done. The other thing that has to be done, and some of this is being done by Caritas and other groups, is what I would call education of people and citizenship, so that they can, for example, go to the mayor's office, and they can demand to see the accounts, and then they can come to public hearings and ask questions of their mayors. Those things in terms of integral development and basically getting people to have the capability to stand up for their rights. So it's a question of both taking responsibility for their lives and demanding others be responsible for the politics. That's what I see is really needs to be done. And there are a lot of things already happening. And as I said, there's people like Moises, people who does this development work, with 2 years of education at most. Petronila, who does work in terms of demanding things from the people in her municipality. Those are the types of things that I think need to be done. And that's long term. That's not short term. And that has to happen whether it's Zelaya or Micheletti or whoever, or whether it's one of the 2 candidates who are running, 2 major candidates who are running. That's what I think has to be done.
So if I'm understanding correctly, you're going to continue the course and not change regardless of how this coup is going to transpire?
Well, in terms of what I'm doing, in terms of what are the groups that I'm working with, we want to continue in the direction of that. The question of what's going to happen in the country is another question, because it appears as if most countries will not recognize an election if the members of the coup are still in charge. That means some of the assistance that has come from governmental groups abroad and from the World Bank will probably not be reinstated, which makes a problem. But it also means a continuation, I believe, of the same system of political patronage that has been there for so many years. So in the one sense, the small groups need to be doing things. And on the other hand, you have, if there's no change, I believe, you'll probably have a continuation of deterioration in terms of a lot of things economically. I mean, I think it's like $200 to $400 million have been lost because of the coup in terms of investments in the country. So you have a major thing. So those are things, and then you're going to have the continuation of the patronage system. So there are 2 things I want to keep separate. One is what I'm doing, which is completely separated from the political realm, and I think has to continue, and the other things that are going to happen in the political and economic realm. So, good questions. Thanks.
Okay.
Somebody else had a question. Comment.
All right. Thank you, John. Please join me in thanking John for his time here. If anyone has any other questions, he'll be up here for personal interaction. Thanks. 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 Thanks.